everyone so much for joining us on this absolutely beautiful day. I promise you, we have so many wonderful images to look at, and this will be, I hope, as much as you'd like it to be a discussion, because these works are very powerful, and I'm sure they'll inspire a response in us too. So again, my name's Jane O'Neill. My background's in art history and in education. And what that means is that I love images, I love beautiful images, but what I love even more than that is a rich conversation about them. So I really invite your questions and your comments as we move through this. So to get us started, I brought in an image by Norman Rockwell that might be familiar to some of you. And I just wanted to sort of warm us up, get our feet wet with talking about art and looking at art with this work here. So does anybody want to throw out what they think is happening in this picture? Juries and duty, I heard somebody say. Anything else?
Woman's opinion.
So, say that again.
It looks like they're trying to convince the one person.
It looks like we've got a holdout, and it looks like everybody's trying to convince her. Great. Anything else from her?
It looked to me like they were badgering her.
Maybe beyond convincing, maybe even badgering. I mean, there's a lot of really intense poses here, right up to somebody's hand, pretty much in her face. And of course, Rockwell painted his own self-portrait hanging over that young woman's head. This is, I think this figure grouping is a very powerful one. And I think any person can immediately sort of put themselves in her shoes, sort of imagining what it's like to be physically surrounded by people who disagree with you. So many of us have probably seen, yes?
But for the time, it's a woman, a lone woman.
A lone woman, and I think that is so important here, particularly for the time. So many of you have probably seen or heard of the movie or the play 12 Angry Men, which came out just 2 years before this. And of course, that was an all-male jury, and there was one holdout who, over the course of several hours, manages to persuade an entire jury to sort of look at the evidence more carefully and to really sort of weigh this idea of reasonable doubt and eventually let a suspect off for a murder charge. And here you sort of get the sense, well, maybe the same thing's playing out, but like you said, we've got a young woman here, and she's sort of at the heart of the argument. And at this time, when this was painted, 1959, in America, in some states, women still couldn't even serve on juries. So the fact that she's here is really the sticking point in so many ways. So we have Norman Rockwell in 1959 looking at the justice system in terms of the subject of the piece, but it's also sort of making a bigger commentary on social justice at this time. So we're going to be thinking about Norman Rockwell as a commentator on social justice in some ways and how that plays out in his career. Because certainly for the most part, we think of sort of warm, fuzzy feelings when it comes to Norman Rockwell. So the title of the talk hits on inclusion, exclusion, and then we're really going to dive into how he looks at and represents race in the United States. So let's think of inclusion. And the way I have sort of identified this is through this idea of the American dream. Norman Rockwell was able to create incredible images that make us all feel like we are a part of the American dream. And he does this so effectively with the use of, or with storytelling related to the nuclear family. So what we're looking at here is an image called, it's sort of a split screen image. It's called Going and Coming. So can you tell what's going on in this picture? Right, so we've got sort of a nuclear family probably going to the beach. You can see that there's a little boat on top of the car here and an umbrella, and coming home. And of course, you're supposed to have a nice little chuckle here because the family is full of energy and excitement here, heading off for a day vacation. And then by the time they get back, mom's asleep, dad's sort of deflated. The actual bubble has deflated from the top to the bottom here. And then the big joke is supposed to be grandma, who is staunch and pretty much the same from top to bottom. So we look at this and we can all immediately relate to this idea of the excitement of going off on a day together and the exhaustion of coming home at the end of the day. But at the same time, this is about the American middle class and the leisure time that the American middle class has. The fact that there's enough prosperity to afford a boat and a family and 3 generations spending a day together like this. This is about American wealth and prosperity. Norman Rockwell extends that idea of the nuclear family and welcomes us all into this idea of the wealth and prosperity of the middle class in America. What's going on in this picture here?
Dad's hiding, he's not going to church.
Dad's hiding, trying to get out of church, right, exactly. And if it wasn't church, this is almost a universal experience, right? We've all had a family member, if it's dad or not, who tries to get out of going to something, whether it's a family gathering or some other kind of obligation. So this was a Saturday Evening Post Easter cover, so we've got the nuclear family all dressed up, ready to go to church, and Dad's still in his jams, and he's got this debris field of newspapers around him, and he's sinking down in his chair as though they don't know he's there, right? Of course, they're marching out, and they're a little miffed that Dad's getting out of it. I love the sideways glance of the boy, too. Norman Rockwell extends, again, this idea of the American dream, this middle-class dream, to images of family reunions, family homecomings. This was the last Christmas cover that he did for the Saturday Evening Post. You can just see a decorated tree back up here. Again, this is the artist's self-portrait, many members of his family here. And we have the homecoming of this young man who's dressed up so nice. He's embraced by his family. And we all, again, can connect back to that idea of reuniting with our family and that good feeling that we have reuniting with our family. And so in this case, I think the one detail that has always rung so true for me with this picture is the bag full of dirty laundry that you bring home for the holidays. So again, it's this middle class life, it's that American dream. And the last one, you can almost not even talk about Rockwell without talking about the middle class in this picture. So oftentimes thought of as Thanksgiving or a Christmas picture, but this is part of his For Freedom series. And we've got an extended family sitting down for this very significant meal here with a patriarch and a matriarch and multiple generations coming together. And I think one of the keys to understanding this piece is this gentleman right here, who looks out at us, the viewer, and he is inviting us to share in what's at that table. We are all, as Americans, a part of this beautiful middle-class dream that we see here. And this was painted in 1943, so we are kind of fresh off of the Great Depression here. And here, there's nothing but cleanliness and abundance and wealth. So the American middle class, Norman Rockwell is so good at making us all feel like we're a part of it. But then he also has this talent. Oh, I should also mention that there are many artists today that are re-examining Norman Rockwell's work and showing it with a larger cast of characters, a more colorful cast of characters, expanding this idea of the American dream to all Americans. So, and that's just one artist up here that has started to do that, but of course, really sort of riffing off of that original Freedom from Want picture. So let's take a look at how Norman Rockwell handles exclusion, what isolation looks like to Norman Rockwell. Can anybody tell what's going on in this picture?
Somebody waiting for retirement.
Waiting for retirement. I like that one. So we've got an older gentleman here in what seems like a pretty sort of sad, kind of stimulus-free kind of environment. If you look closely, you can see that he's working at a ticketing counter. And people are heading off to vacations all around him, and he's literally stuck in a box behind bars, and he seems bored, lonely, and yet it's sort of a feeling that most of us can relate to. We've all been stuck somewhere at some point thinking there's got to be more than this, right? But feeling so isolated at the same time. What about a picture like this? What's happening with this young woman? A coat girl, right? She is a human hat rack, a human coat closet. You can see just over her shoulder, there's a sign that points to a convention. So you can almost imagine all these people flooding in, dropping their coats on her, and she's standing there thinking, I need a better job, right? So, and just looking so alone, looking like she's so filled with untapped potential here. So I think, again, an unfulfilling job, we've all sort of been there and all sort of had that feeling of, I wish I was a part of something bigger, something better.
What's in her hand? Is that the old, is it cigarettes? Is she the old cigarette girl?
That's a great question. What's in her hand? And I haven't looked too carefully, but I think you're right. I think those probably are cigarettes.
Yeah.
Norman Rockwell also gives us scenes like this, where it's loneliness in a crowd. This picture always reminds me of the movie White Christmas when they're heading up to Vermont on the train, hoping for snow. This is just called Skiers on a Train. And so we see all these people in these festive red sweaters, and it looks like they almost all know each other. If they didn't, now they do, right? They've become fast friends on the train. They'll be having a great time on the slopes in no time. And then you have this poor gentleman here who is so not a part of this, has probably never been on skis his entire life, doesn't even understand the language they're speaking. And Norman Rockwell has shown us what it feels like to be lonely in a crowd really effectively. He does this in many different ways over the course of his career. For some reason, I have always found this picture to be so poignant. Again, I think in many ways it's a universal experience of being a child at some point, getting up, seeing adults interacting, and sort of knowing that you're not a part of that world yet, maybe longing to be a part of that world. So we've got the little girl at the top of the stairs here, sort of wishing for the next phase of life, perhaps. And then loneliness in a loving relationship. This is a picture called Breakfast. And you know if it was painted today, they'd both have their cell phones out, right? She wouldn't be quite so lonely. But for right now, there's a wall between them called the newspaper, and she's looking off into the distance, wishing that there was someone to connect with, right? I love this picture so much. This one's called The Soda Jerk. This is Norman Rockwell's son who's posing. But I include it because of this boy over here. We've got an intense flirtation happening at the top center, but Norman Rockwell was sure to include this boy in the upper left, who shows us what it feels like when you're not a part of those flirtations at all. So again, sort of being on the outside of things. And then the last kind of loneliness that Norman Rockwell is so good at showing us is the person who's sort of left behind. And in this case, this is 1945. It's the end of the year, 1945. So we've got all the GIs who have come home after World War II. And you know this was an incredible New Year's Eve party. And this is the waiter at the end of the night. You can see he's got a big platter here. So you know he probably didn't get to kiss anyone, and he's the person who has to stay here and clean up. And he's got this sort of defeated posture that we can so sort of clearly understand, even though we can't see his face. One other person who's been left behind is this gentleman here. Obviously a political candidate who just got a phone call here, and we know immediately it didn't go his way, right? All of his supporters are filing out of the room, and he looks like he's been knocked senseless by this. So immediately, with just a moment in time, his fortunes have changed, and he's alone. Nobody knows you when you're down and out, right? So these are such incredible pictures that really get to the heart of our human experience, right? Of our American experience. So let's shift gears and think about why Norman Rockwell wasn't representing a more diverse America. because look at what's going on the covers of other magazines during this time. 47, we've got Jackie Robinson on Time magazine. 54, Dorothy Dandridge. We've got a segregation story in Newsweek, and Thurgood Marshall in 1955. So what's happening with Norman Rockwell? Well, he wrote that his editor from the Saturday Evening Post was a very liberal man, but told me never to show colored people except as servants. And this was a very clear, very stated policy at the Saturday Evening Post. So we think of these images as being so incredible and so wonderful and just sort of lighthearted representations of American life, but they were curated from a very particular point of view. So I want to show you what that policy looked like in actuality by showing you a couple of other illustrations by other artists from the Saturday Evening
When
Post.
did he write that letter? When did he finally come out and say?
That's a good question. Offhand, I don't know. He was very clear about it after he left. Yes, yeah. I don't think he talked about it while he was there, at least not publicly. So in practice, this is what it looked like over the course of, essentially from the 1920s to the 1950s. This was what you could see on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. So we're seeing blackface minstrels. This is 1930. And we certainly see a lot of people of color in subservient roles. So here we have what looks like a starlet, right? She's carrying a bouquet of flowers. She's got the requisite little dog. And then we have this poor man behind her who's literally just carrying all of her stuff. And he's almost there as like another status symbol in some ways. 1937, what we're looking at is a 4th of July parade with two little boys who have climbed a lamppost to get a better view. And I should emphasize here, these are not Norman Rockwell illustrations. These are just to sort of show you what was the norm for the Saturday Evening Post. So these two little boys, we've got one who's triumphant, very well taken care of, beautiful clothes. And then over here, we've got another little boy who's struggling to hang on, and his clothes are threadbare. The Saturday Evening Post was also sort of working with some well-known stereotypes by this time too. So 1934 and 39, we see that they're making use of the mammy stereotype that was pretty prevalent essentially since the 19th century. But they were a little bit equal opportunity. Here we've got a very plump white woman who's got all these cleaning supplies. She's wearing almost the exact same garb as some of the mammies that we've seen. And here she's depicted as Queen of the May because she's doing her spring cleaning. But more often than not, on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, if you were a housewife, you still looked gorgeous, even if your life was total chaos. It was pretty unusual to show white women looking like this. So there are a lot of these kinds of images. I want to be clear that these were stereotypes that were pervasive in the culture. So in this case, there's cooking, there's doing laundry, and we've got a 1941 image here where it's called Sweeping It Under the Rug, where there's almost a suggestion of something sinister happening here as well. And like I said, these are sort of pervasive in the culture. So in the 1930s, we also have the book and the movie Gone with the Wind, and we have Hattie McDaniel as the servant here, or as the slave, and again, sort of working with stereotypes that are sort of are pervasive in the culture. And those are still existing in our culture today, up through Aunt Jemima syrup and Uncle Ben's rice. And then if you've read or seen the movie The Help, it featured some of the best known African-American artists, the most talented African-American actresses that are out there today. And Viola Davis in particular said she regretted doing the movie because it really didn't share the voices of the maids in the way that she had hoped. So let's pivot again. We have this sense of what's out there and what the Saturday Evening Post was publishing. So how does that involve Norman Rockwell, and what did his work look like? The first image I'm showing you here, this is by Norman Rockwell, and this is one of his earliest depictions that includes a person of color. This is from 1926, and this was actually not for the Saturday Evening Post. It was for an advertisement for varnish, which I guess is why the rug has been rolled up here, and you can see a bare hardwood floor. Does anybody have a sense of what's happening in this picture here?
A young boy just beating out the beat.
Yeah.
I think it's two logs from the fireplace.
Right, okay, so he's got two logs that could be from the fireplace, and we get the sense that he's doing the percussion, and this gentleman here is doing the banjo music.
Just totally oblivious to people's stations in life.
Okay, so in this picture, it seems as though the characters are sort of oblivious to stations in life, any sort of like racial, political, cultural stereotypes, that sort of thing. They're just playing and enjoying the music. And certainly, I mean, Norman Rockwell's turned the back of the little boy to us, and he's really spotlit this character over here. And we can see that his clothes are really torn up. We get the sense that this is a pretty poor person. I look at this and I'm very curious as to how these people are in the same room. What brought them together in this room here? Because I'm assuming that this is the boy's house. So again, this is a black man playing a banjo is another sort of strong stereotype that carries over from the 19th century in American culture. So black minstrels, particularly in the early 1800s, often featured people who played the bones and people who played the banjo. And this extended up through blackface minstrelsy in the early 1900s. And one sort of bright sort of breath of fresh air in the stereotype that persisted that essentially was saying, well, there's a predisposition here. There's a special talent among black people for playing a banjo. The bright light of truth over here comes from a black artist at the end of the 1900s, or I'm sorry, at the end of the 1800s. This is 1893. And the artist here is Henry O. Tanner. And he shows us a familial grouping here. I always read this as sort of a grandfather and a grandson, where there's this gentle sort of banjo lesson that's happening here, which is sort of defying any stereotype that there's sort of this intrinsic talent there, that it is nurtured and that it comes from these family relationships. So Norman Rockwell sort of dabbling in something that you could easily consider a stereotype in this case. So if we move forward through time, we can see how Norman Rockwell decides to include people of color, but also abide by the Saturday Evening Post's rule about showing people in subservient positions. So in both of these cases, what we see him doing is turning the black figures in these cases, turning their backs to us, obscuring their identities in many cases. And so what we're seeing in both of these pictures, and this one's called He Went That-A-Way, and this one's called The Full Treatment. So what we see is somebody who's sort of in a high station in life, right? Who's just fallen off a horse, and she's getting the news from this little boy of where her horse went. And then over here, what looks to be sort of a successful businessman who's getting the full treatment at sort of a salon and getting his nails done and getting his shoes shined. And in this case, the fact that there's sort of these young African Americans who are helping them, again, it sort of helps to bolster their positions in some ways. Now, it's around this time that Norman Rockwell says this: I was born a white Protestant with some prejudices, which I'm continuously trying to eradicate. So he's what I think you would call today an anti-racist. In fact, that he felt this so strongly that he had a brother who would frequently make racist jokes, and Norman Rockwell decided to not have contact with him. So he began to feel this very strongly, and it began to show up in his work more and more, this idea of trying to eradicate himself of any prejudices. This is sort of a rarely talked about work that Norman Rockwell did in the 1930s. And this was not in the Saturday Evening Post. This was an illustration for an article in American Magazine. And the name of the article, or the story, it's called Love Wanga. And Wanga in this case means like a voodoo. So the story here is that this sort of sophisticated city girl is going to this kind of country church, hoping to find someone to help her with a voodoo spell that she wanted to cast on someone. So we see this interaction between city and country. And if you look really closely, you can see sort of all eyes are on her, and she's looking very uncomfortable. But there are many people that look at this picture and they look at this young woman and they say, wow, she's actually one of the most beautiful women that Norman Rockwell ever painted. He tended to do a lot of caricature, you know, equal opportunity. And here she's a very striking figure. Norman Rockwell also illustrated another story that allowed him to explore sort of racial politics and explore black models in this case, because we see, and the story here is called The Proud Possessor. This is from 1940, and it's a story about this boy with his dogs. He wants to keep the dogs, and he's asking for help to watch them with this boy over here. So Norman Rockwell, if you're familiar with his work, you might know that he loved to photograph his models, and he would take anywhere from 50 to 100 photographs of models so he could get the precise pose he was looking for. So at this point in his life, he's already moved to Arlington, Vermont, and he doesn't really have access to a very diverse cast of models here. So he's very specifically seeking out models to help him with this work. So then we move up through time to the 1940s. And we're at 1943, and Norman Rockwell is making this famous series of the Four Freedoms, inspired by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's State of the Union address from 2 years earlier. And I always think of this as an incredible feat. If somebody were to ask you, how do you illustrate freedom from fear? Where would you even start? So Norman Rockwell gives us freedom of speech, where we have an Abraham Lincoln look-alike standing up at a New England town hall meeting, and you're supposed to get the sense that he's saying something unpopular, but people are still yielding him the floor because in America, everybody's got the freedom of speech. Here we've got our freedom of want with the giant turkey, and then of course freedom from fear, where we can tuck our children into bed at night without fear of attack or violence or danger. And you can see in the newspaper here just the fragment of the headline that says bombings and horror. So he's reading about what's happening in the world, but that doesn't happen here in America. So the last of these freedoms, and the one that Norman Rockwell illustrated second in this series, is the freedom of religion. And he wanted to take this opportunity to couple that with racial tolerance. And so this is the resulting work, which is so different from the other three paintings. So what he's done here is he's created this very compressed, sort of flattened space, and he's showing all these different people of different faiths in a moment of prayer. And so we're getting these different skin tones, and he's very consciously sort of slipping them into the margins so that the Saturday Evening Post would, in fact, publish these works, and they did. Just to give you a sense of sort of where he got started, originally the idea for freedom of religion was going to be a little bit more like storytelling, like the other three paintings. And he thought of a barber shop where you could have like a Catholic priest and a Protestant and a Jew, and then also a black man who's coming in the door here, and that they would all originally be singing together and then maybe just hanging out together. And then he felt like he was relying a little too much on stereotypes, and then he went to the image that we know. But you can see it really sticks out here. It's just a different kind of picture. And he worked for about 2 months on that picture, just that one alone. So by the 1940s and the 1950s, Norman Rockwell is this very highly esteemed artist. He's very successful. People love his work, and the Saturday Evening Post knows that too. So you have a work like this from 1945 called Homecoming. So who's come home? Our GI, right? And we see him from the back, and we see dozens of figures who are so excited to see him, right? Welcoming him home. We've got mom who's thrown open her arms. We've got the rest of the family. We've got the sweetheart waiting around the corner. And then your eye can move over here and around this picture, and you see there's so many faces in this picture. And in particular, there's also a little black boy up in the tree. And if you compare that to what his colleagues were doing from just a few years earlier, what Norman Rockwell's doing here seems pretty benign in comparison. He actually went to Troy, New York, and he was looking at specific tenements and photographing them, sketching them, and he was sketching what life looked like at these tenements in Troy, New York. And he knew, I'm going to include this boy because he's the type of person that's there. It makes it true. And he was very committed to the truth in his works. So then something happens in terms of current events that's really important to Norman Rockwell. And it's sort of a local story for Vermont. I'm not sure if anybody here has ever heard of Crystal Malone before. So this is 1946, and this is Crystal Malone. And she's one of 2 black students at the University of Vermont. And she's invited to join a sorority while she's there. And so these are all of her sorority sisters, like literally welcoming her. And this becomes a story, I believe, in Life magazine, because she's invited in, and then the head of that organization, the head of that sorority, the national head, comes driving up from Washington, D.C. to Vermont and says to Crystal Malone, don't do this. Really, like, you shouldn't be a part of this. And the girls of this sorority say, if you don't want us with Crystal, then you don't want us. And they actually asked the president of the university to sort of go to bat for them and say, stand up for us, stand up for Crystal. And the president of the university was very wishy-washy, and all of these letters started to pour in from all over Vermont and from across the country. And guess who wrote in? Norman Rockwell. And he said, stand up for those girls. So he took interest in this, and he knew that this was an important story. And again, he saw it as an opportunity for racial equality, which is what he was really advocating for at this point in his life. So let's see how this was playing out. Oh, and I should mention, they ultimately ended up burning their sorority charter, and just so that they could all sort of stay together and outside of the rules of that sorority. And here's Crystal Malone a few years ago. It took until 2008 before the sorority wanted to apologize for what happened in '46. So Norman Rockwell is given a key commission that same year. This is 1946. He is asked to paint the 4th of July cover for the Saturday Evening Post. And they decide that they want to do the Statue of Liberty. And I want to show you a couple of versions of the Statue of Liberty from the Saturday Evening Post that came. This is 1934, this is 1942. So these are other artists, but this is the way the Statue of Liberty was typically depicted. And so when Norman Rockwell started thinking about, okay, well, what do I want to say with my Statue of Liberty cover? He's always interested in people. So this is an oil sketch that he did in preparation. And he thought, what if they're looking up at the Statue of Liberty and we sort of see, different walks of life, kind of appreciating this idea of liberty. He went back and forth with his editor, and ultimately they decided on something really different. They thought, what if we could show people cleaning the Statue of Liberty? And they actually called the Statue of Liberty, and they said, does anybody ever clean the statue? And they said, no, but we do have people who clean the torch. And the torch is made of heavy amber glass. And we put people all the way up there, and they clean that. And they said, let's get photographs of it. That's what I want to paint. And so you can see he's cropped this very differently. I mean, it's not this reverential Statue of Liberty. We just get the back of her head. It's really about sort of the heroism of getting up on that arm about 300 feet off of the ground. And so what we have here is actually 5 figures. I don't know how well you can see them. We've got 1, 2, 3. 3 up here is supposed to be Norman Rockwell again. 4 and 5. And of course, this was on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. but you'll notice there is a black man up there. And it seems as though nobody really noticed that he was there, unbelievably. So this was once owned by Steven Spielberg, and he gave it to the White House as a work of art to be displayed there. And you can see for years, it was actually hung over this sculpture by Frederick Remington called the Bronco Buster. And I think I think somebody drew a connection between the idea of the statue's arm and the Bronco Buster who's sort of raising his arm and sort of taming the horse here. Well, after a researcher sort of noticed that there's an African American who's sort of a co-equal taking part in this activity, in this picture, I think people started to think of the Statue of Liberty picture very differently. As in terms of its critical reception, and when it was made, it was kind of a flop. People didn't really make that connection right after the war of we are cleaning the light of liberty, and it's still going strong, and we're still leaders in the world spreading liberty. And instead, people just didn't really look at it that closely. And it wasn't until about 2010, 2011, that there was a researcher who said, hey, look at this guy. Norman Rockwell included this gentleman here who's taking part in this significant activity. And when she pointed it out to the head of the Norman Rockwell Museum, the head of the museum said, oh, he's not supposed to be there. That's not something that the Saturday Evening Post would have gone for. So I think after that came to light, you can see they changed the installation at the White House and they put it over Martin Luther King Jr. because this is a much more powerful statement about liberty now when you think about the fact that he's going against the Saturday Evening Post rules. He's showing people of different races working together for this just cause. It now has a greater meaning. Now, Norman Rockwell's trajectory forward in terms of this interest in civil rights and social justice is not a clear path. I think you have complicated works like this that come just at about the same time, the second half of the 1940s. So what's going on in this picture? And this was on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, I should say.
Serving a richer boy.
Right, so we have this man here and he's serving a little boy. And did you say a little rich boy? Yeah, we've got a little rich boy here who actually has his little coin purse out and he's calculating the tip of what he should give this man. And I think any of us here right now thinking about if I ever had to wait for a tip from a child, that would be a really complicated feeling, right? Maybe not the best feeling of waiting for a tip from a child. I want to show you this gentleman's face up close. I would say that's a complicated expression too. I think you can read this in many different ways. But the history of what we're looking at here too is important. So this would have been a Pullman Porter. So there's the Pullman cars, and there's the tradition of being a Pullman Porter, and they were traditionally African-American men. And they made great tips working as porters. Pullman Porters are credited with really helping to establish a black middle class in America. But they were also initially recruited right after slavery, this idea of, oh, well, black men have been trained to serve and they'll do very well at this. So they were, and they did, like I said, through tips. They were not paid well, but they did make great tips at this. They were also the first black union in the United States, but that dates back to the 1920s. So there's a strange dynamic here. They talked about being the top of their community when they were home, but when they were on the train, they were sort of the bottom rung. And so it was a respected position, but a complicated one. And I think you sort of get that in the face here. There was also sort of a line that they sort of had amongst themselves, which was smiles for miles. You know, you gotta wear the smile because we're working for tips, of course. Here's another artist's interpretation of the same sort of dynamic here. This is from 1937 on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. And you can see there's a much clearer power dynamic at play, I would argue here, with the little boy about to sort of expertly tip an older gentleman here. So Norman Rockwell is sort of exploring a sort of tough, sort of gray area here. And I think there's you can sort of mine a lot of the complication in this picture too. All right, there are complicated things happening in Norman Rockwell's life at this time too. In the early 1950s, he had a wife who was struggling with depression and substance abuse. And she was traveling from Vermont to Stockbridge, Massachusetts to get services. And so one night, they up and moved to Stockbridge, Massachusetts. This is Norman Rockwell later on in life with a much beloved picture of Stockbridge because they become very closely associated with it. So while his wife is getting counseling, he starts to get counseling too. And one of the things that's really troubling him is this idea that he wants to create something serious, he wants to create something that's really meaningful, and he has this deep-seated sense that he can't do that because of this rule at the Saturday Evening Post. So it takes a while for him to realize this and to actually make a move. But this happens, that move to Stockbridge happens in 1953. This is a work from 1959. And it's another one of these sort of complicated, sort of tenement style works here. Can anybody tell what's happening in this picture? There's a lot of figures here. It's the dog, right? It all comes to the dog. And actually every sort of perspectival line here, all of the pointing, all leads your eye right to this little dog. This is a picture that's called Roadblock. So we see this giant truck here is stuck in this narrow alley. Nobody can move, nobody can get by because this little dog won't move. And Norman Rockwell has included his own self-portrait, his son. This is actually the director of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. So we've got all of these figures crowded in, and it's this sort of sweet, lighthearted thing. And as you know, Norman Rockwell took photographs of everybody. He planned this out very carefully. However, he did not take photographs of these two little kids. These two little kids. He added them in later because sort of like with the homecoming that we saw earlier, he just had the strong sense that they belonged there, that this was the neighborhood where they would live, and it would be true to the painting to have them there. So again, we see them from behind, but it's significant. They're right there at the front. All right.
Who's that looking back?
I know, isn't that a funny face right there? He always loves to have that person breaking the fourth wall, right? I'm not sure who she would be. All right, so we have towards the end of the 50s, the beginning of the 1960s, Norman Rockwell getting ready to leave the Saturday Evening Post. And he was really their prize pony. They loved him. He did great things for them, and I think he was happy with the name recognition and the respect that he had gotten because he was so successful there. So here we have 1960, and Norman Rockwell himself is the cover story at this point. So we've got his triple self-portrait here, but it also says America's best loved artist finally tells his own story. So you can see there's, it seems from the outside that there's a mutual admiration society going on here. And it's at this time, right before he leaves, 1961, that he's able to get this cover on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. And this is a painting that he did called The Golden Rule. So do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Can you think of anything that's less controversial than the Golden Rule, right? I mean, we all just look at that and we're like, of course, that's how you treat people. But of course, in certain parts of America at this time, it was do unto others that look like you. So Norman Rockwell is still really pressing boundaries here, and he went out of his way to find models, to populate this scene, and to authentically and I would say sort of humanely depict people from all walks of life from all around the globe. So he does this, And then 2 years later, he leaves the Saturday Evening Post. This is one of the last works that he created. This was not for the Saturday Evening Post, but it falls within that time. This is called Lincoln for the Defense. This was the illustration, an illustration for a story here, where we see Abraham Lincoln, who Norman Rockwell really loved and admired. Prior to becoming the president, he was an attorney, and in this case, he is defending this young man here, and he actually gets him acquitted for a murder. So it sort of goes back to like our jury room scene from where we started. All right, so Norman Rockwell leaves the Saturday Evening Post, and we have him saying, for 47 years, I portrayed the best of all possible worlds, grandfathers, puppy dogs, things like that. That kind of stuff is dead now, and I think it's about time. I think when it comes to Norman Rockwell, we have someone who gets a little radical for his time, at least, in his older age. So 1963, we have him giving $500 for a lifetime membership to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And then shortly after that, he creates this remarkable work, so different from what he was doing prior to that. So this is 1964, and this is a painting that he did for Look magazine. I believe it was inside Look magazine, not on the cover, and it's called The Problem We All Live With. So what's going on in this picture? It's Ruby Bridges, yep. Right, so it's a little girl being escorted to school. These are deputy U.S. Marshals, and she's integrating a Southern school. What are the details that Norman Rockwell's showing us here, or your reaction? What's that?
The tomatoes.
The tomatoes, right? Your eye goes right to them because for the most part, there's not a lot of color in this picture. So when you see that red, your eye goes right to it. And she has just passed that splattered tomato on the wall, and you have to wonder, how close was that, right? I think our minds also connect red splatter with blood too. So I think immediately, like we are thinking of danger when we look at this picture. Any other reactions to this picture?
Her dress is extremely white and clean and crisp.
Yes, this clean, white, crisp dress. Your eye goes right to it. It sort of underscores this idea of innocence, right? Yeah, absolutely. And underscores the idea of a well taken care of child, too. Somebody really cared about her. Any other reactions to this work or questions about it?
It takes 4 dwarfing and daunting law enforcement officials to make it happen.
Yeah, what a great comment, too. The fact that it takes 4 grown men to protect this little girl going to school is really something. And of course, I have a few photographs of what was happening at the time. So this is little Ruby Bridges, the U.S. Marshals here. And what Norman Rockwell, of course, doesn't show us is the angry mob. And there certainly was an angry mob that existed outside of that school. Save segregation, vote states' rights. All I want for Christmas is a clean white school. There were even people who demonstrated with a baby in a coffin. There were people, again, with signs like this, integration is a mortal sin. This is what little Ruby Bridges was facing as she was walking into school. And believe it or not, as Norman Rockwell was up in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, sort of struggling, I want to do something important, significant, it was his counselor that said, well, I know somebody working with this little girl down in Louisiana. You should know about the story of Ruby Bridges. So it was the counselor that suggested this connection. And it's interesting to me that Norman Rockwell doesn't really show us the mob. He shows us the strength. And I just wanted to show you this very quickly. This was an exhibition in Indiana, and they wanted to show the power of children making a difference. And they show the school and they show the mob so that visitors to that museum can have the experience of walking through that mob, which I think is a really powerful thing. Norman Rockwell's painting certainly got attention. And some good, some bad. I wanted to share this letter with you. I've never written to a national figure before, nor do I intend to make a habit of it. Allow me to say that I've never been so deeply moved by any picture as your painting in the current issue. Thank you for showing this white Southerner how ridiculous he looks. The truth is pretty hard to take until we get it from a Norman Rockwell. Wow, that's incredible. So I wanted to show you too sort of how he arrived at the solution, knowing that he was going to have this work cover 2 pages. He knew that the center of the picture would be in the fold, or what they called the gutter. So he knew Ruby either had to sort of be in front or sort of behind, that she couldn't quite be in the center here. So it's sort of a different story too if there's if she's sort of lagging a little bit, and if the red is over here. Here it's like she's eager to go to school, and she certainly was. Here are some little girls that he had model for him, and I love the detail of how he puts their little feet up on the board so that because he knows he wants Ruby in motion. And then on the 50th anniversary of the integration of Southern schools, Barack Obama asks the Norman Rockwell Museum if he can borrow this work and have it at the White House. And he situated it just outside the Oval Office so that he could still see it from his desk. So this is our first Black president looking at this incredible picture by Norman Rockwell. And you know who this is? Ruby Bridges. And there's a video of this encounter, and he turns and he says to her, "I'm here because you were there and you did that." Ruby Bridges attended that school and sat in a classroom by herself for that whole year. There was one teacher from Boston who would teach her. They stopped selling groceries to her mother. Her father lost her job, and her grandparents, who were sharecroppers, were kicked off their land. Also, this little girl could get an education. So this was a story that really mattered to Norman Rockwell, and it mattered to America. And so what he's created has this long-lasting effect. I want to connect it back to this idea that we started with of inclusion, exclusion, and I think what he sort of does with Ruby Bridges is he taps into some of these universal feelings that we have. We know we look at Ruby Bridges here and we can immediately project ourselves into that position and know how lonely it is, and more so than this, how scary and dangerous it is. What a significant thing. So over the course of the next few years of Norman Rockwell's career, he takes up the issue of civil rights again and again. This one's known as Southern Justice. He had heard about the story of 3 civil rights advocates who were murdered in Mississippi, in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And this is the final work here. This is a sketch that he did for it. So what he's painted here is the actual act of the murder that's taking place. I think in the final version, it's almost harder to understand what's happening. You have to really be looking for those shadows here. But it's a largely monochromatic work, and what really stands out is the blood. So in this case, what made this killing so particularly horrific too was that this was the deputy. This was the police that murdered the civil rights workers here. And they were supported by the Klan in doing this. So this is the moment where they meet their fate, which was a moment that was pretty important for Norman Rockwell, something he really wanted to convey. He continues to look at racial inequality and how that speaks to all levels of society. This was an article in Look magazine that was written by Sargent Shriver, and it was called "How Goes the War on Poverty?" And Norman Rockwell created this illustration of the hands clasping each other, reaching up for help, and a diverse cast of characters in the background, sort of speaking to how the fact that poor America is a very diverse America too. And then probably one of his last and significant works that looks at race in America is this one here, The New Kids on the Block, or The New Kids in the Neighborhood. This is 1967. And this has become a really iconic work too, but maybe not quite with that same punch that you have with Ruby Bridges. So we've got a new family that's moved into the neighborhood. How's it going? We've got this sort of fraught interaction that's happening here, right? They're sort of checking each other out. They're curious. There's a lot of differences there. But Norman Rockwell gives us a sign that everything is going to be just fine.
Dog. Baseball glove.
Dog baseball gloves. So not only did they both have pets, but on both sides, they got their baseball gloves. So even though this moment might be a little bit uncomfortable or outside of their norm, you get the sense that in 5 minutes, they'll all be playing. And it's Norman Rockwell saying, we have so much more in common than these differences that we think are so divisive. Although, there's a little tiny detail here, and if you've got great eyes, you can see there's a nosy neighbor up there who's maybe not quite as comfortable as what you see playing out in front of you. Here's Norman Rockwell with his models. Apparently that cat was just the worst. Hard to get a cat to model for you here. But he was very mindful of the body language here and what that body language would convey. It's very purposeful that she's leaning forward the way that she is, and she's leaning back a little bit the way that she is. And of course, this picture has inspired works that are still being made today, like this one. This is a mural down in New Orleans. So we get the roles reversed here. White kids moving into a black neighborhood, but guess what? They all have soccer balls, so it's going to work out. Norman Rockwell, of course, took these works really seriously, and this was getting towards the end of his life. And with a work like this, I would say that we're sort of almost, we've arrived at something that sort of unifies this idea of the middle-class American dream that we started with, and even a little bit of that loneliness and isolation that we also talked about. It sort of all comes together in a work like this. You feel all of it. It's middle-class America, and it's a little bit of isolation. A lot has been written about that moving truck in particular, and as a device, how it sort of separates them, but also unites them. The fact that they're set against it over here, and the fact that they're connected by that ramp. It's an interesting sort of pictorial device here.
The white guy moving them in.
And it's a white guy who could care less about what's happening out in front of the truck, right? There are a few last works that Norman Rockwell did that I wanted to show you sort of quickly, because he, like I said, he gets almost a little radical towards the end of his life. Look at him, he's painting hippies when he's in his 80s. This is a work that's called The Right to Know. So this is 1968. This is in the midst of the Vietnam War. And this is sort of petitioning your government for the right to know. And this accompanied an article that was that focused on the war. It focused on racial equality. So it's Norman Rockwell, again, sort of like the Golden Rule, giving us a diverse cast of characters that is America. And in this case, sort of telling the powers that be that we're the governed, but we also govern you too. We elect you. And then as Norman Rockwell's career sort of winds down, this is the last cover that he did. This was for American Artist magazine. This is 1976. Of course, it's his self-portrait. And he's, for the centennial, or bicentennial, he's putting a little happy birthday banner on the Liberty Bell. And a lot can be said that it's the Liberty Bell. It's not the Statue of Liberty. It's not some other icon. The Liberty Bell is flawed. And I think he saw this as sort of a flawed democracy, but it was one that he loved and worth celebrating in his estimation. So you can see here, this is 2 years before he passed away, and he had cataracts, and his hand-eye coordination is not what it had been. So there's passages here that are not as clean and crisp with that detail that we know and love from him. The next year, he won the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Gerald Ford. And then after he passed away, even the Saturday Evening Post was sort of honoring him again. So to wrap up, we see Norman Rockwell come a very long way over the course of his career. We see him bucking at that rule from the Saturday Evening Post, and we see him as somebody who, well, I always go back to the idea that he was not said to be very religious or very political, but I think these works show that he had a lot of faith in humanity and that he loved his fellow man. And so what we see today is a lot of artists that go back to his formula, to the archetypes that he created, and they tell the same story, again, with a more diverse cast of characters. And you gotta believe, based on what you see today, that if Norman Rockwell were here, he would have loved it. In fact, if he didn't have the certain rules to play by in the 1940s, he might have created works that look just like this, right? So that puts us at about an hour. I thank you for your attention, and I welcome any questions or comments that anybody has. Thank you. Thank you.